Hello and welcome to News from Nowhere, the podcast which keeps you up to date with the central developments in Scottish politics every Monday in your inbox. My name is Coll McCail. Today is the 26th of July and I'm delighted to be joined for what promises to be a bumper episode, I suspect, by Rory Hamilton and Samuel Rafanell-Williams. Rory, how are you?
Very well, thanks. How are you, Cole?
Very well, very well. Nice to have you back after a couple of weeks off. Samuel, what about you? How's things?
Yeah, I'm good. I've had a lovely weekend and it's great to be here with Rory back after his holiday.
Yeah, we have a lot to get through this week, as I alluded to earlier, but a moment first to say that this podcast is produced by virtue of a few kind supporters who pay the small price of £5 a month or more to support Scotia on Patreon. If you're in a position to join them and support Media for a Better Scotland, please do. We know that hundreds of people listen to this podcast every week, but only a fraction of those are in a position to donate. If you're one of them, we would welcome the support. If not, then you can review the podcast wherever you're listening and join our WhatsApp channel and mailing list. The links to both are in the show notes. I think we should start this week with the headlines. I will begin by passing to yourself, Rory, to open us up.
Yeah, I begin with the news that the UK's largest onshore wind farm, which is at Eaglesham, Whiteley Wind Farm, south of Glasgow, is set to be flattened and then rebuilt with fewer, although larger turbines. This is an announcement that Scottish Power Renewables say the existing 215 turbines will be replaced in 3 phases. With about 124 new turbines, which are apparently 110 metres taller. The takeaway for me for this is that the Scottish Government is necessarily involved in the planning application and the energy consent to it, but it's not really taking up the opportunity to bring energy into public ownership. And this feels like a really missed opportunity for, I don't know, those opportunities which don't necessarily come up all the time in the energy sector for the Scottish Government. I'll pass on to you, Sam.
Yeah, in other climate-related news, I suppose you could say, the Highland wildfires in the Cairngorms continue to rage as smoke reaches Aberdeen. And the residents of the village Nethy Bridge were evacuated on Friday night, but they were allowed to return just today, from what I can gather from BBC reporting. But that's 12 days now. Scottish Fire and Rescue Service has been battling these fires with 500 firefighters deployed. Today, John Swinney said that welcome progress has been made in tackling the wildfires. Note that we also heard that last weekend. But it does seem that the emergency services themselves also no longer consider the fire a major incident. This may be due to some help from the rains over the past few days, helping to dampen the fire. The UK government has offered firefighting resources if they are needed, though the Scottish government maintains the Scottish Fire Service is adequately resourced to deal with these wildfires. Nevertheless, as we've mentioned on this programme recently, questions should be asked about whether recent cuts to Scottish Fire and Rescue Service have played a role in having these fires go larger and longer than could have been avoided. Highland community figures and council leaders have said that the Scottish Government's response was too slow and that they were asking for a major incident declaration for several days before it was eventually made. Over to you, Coll.
Yeah, I'm going to raise a couple of stories this week relating to Palestine. This first one I think is particularly important, and that is the news reported in the Sunday Mail today of the Scottish Palestinian Solidarity Campaign's debanking, which has gone on since last June. That means that SPSC have been unable to access £20,000 and more worth of funds by virtue of the fact that they have lost access to their Unity Trust bank account without any explanation. Now, this is an increasingly concerning pattern that we are seeing across the country. Only earlier this month, the Canary, the Britain-wide leftist outlet, were debanked by Lloyds. This is concerning not least because of the questions it raises regarding repression, but more fundamentally because of the implications it has for the Scottish Palestine solidarity movement, preventing SPSC from doing the work of organising marches and demonstrations that we know to have been so critical in moving the Scottish and UK governments' position on Gaza over the last 3 years. So a pretty chilling story, now making its way into the mainstream media after a year. And I don't think we should understate the impact that that would have on any organisation's operation. The bank in question, Unity Trust, is of course the bank which, as many listeners will know, charities and trade unions regularly go to in order to set up branch banking accounts and whatnot. So I suppose of note that even Unity Trust have succumbed to this increasingly repressive environment. But with that, I'll pass to you, Rory.
Yeah, I'm glad that Sam raised the wildfires in Scotland. It's in the context of 300,000 people being evacuated across France and Spain, with more wildfires there. I've heard even that the smoke plumes from near Bordeaux and near Madrid have actually connected over the belt. So lots of implications there, which I'm sure we'll get onto perhaps in a later episode. But my next piece is actually potentially also fire related, in that this week the the Glasgow School of Arts Board of Governors admitted, or they finally settled the 2-year insurance dispute over the 2018 fire that gutted the building. And they admitted that the payout was never going to fully cover the cost of the £265 million needed to rebuild Charles Rennie Mackintosh's iconic building, the Glasgow School of Art. However, in the same week, a campaign has also been launched to restore the Mac in full, after it was reported that, and I think it was misleadingly reported, that initially it was just going to be a facade that was maintained of the original building, and actually the building behind would be a modern or essentially a cheaper building built. Now, rightfully, this campaign is hoping to restore the true architectural designs of Charles Rennie Mackintosh, which this city, Glasgow, is so well known for. The headline which the campaign to rebuild the Mac is going with is that they're calling the Mac our Notre Dame, referencing the burnt down Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, which millionaires and many rich people across the world seem to chip into for its rebuilding in the aftermath. And I wonder what that says about the aims of the campaign, despite its laudable goal of rebuilding the Mac in full. Sam?
Yeah, it would be good if we could access here in Scotland some of those millions that were required to rebuild Notre Dame, but it would also be good if we had the same commitment to the public sphere and our defining architecture. I want to bring it back to an energy-related story relating to nuclear power. The UK government's nuclear safety watchdog is concerned over plans to extend the lifespan of Torness nuclear power station in East Lothian. The station's owner, EDF, has been pressing to keep the plant running despite hundreds of cracks spreading across its highly radioactive reactor cores. And the Office for Nuclear Regulation, ONR, has demanded that the company justify the safety case for extending Torness's operating life, revealing also that the number of cracks in its main reactor has increased by a third in just 6 months, from 585 to 782. For context, Hunterston nuclear plant closed down in 2022 with 586 cracks across its 2 reactors. So this news also comes as confusion reigns about the permanent nuclear waste dump proposed for the Cumbria coast, without which industry leaders doubt the credibility and sustainability of their industry. This has caused some consternation, given that Ed Miliband made no statement on the status of the project before changing his brief to Foreign Secretary. So things not looking great for the nuclear industry at the moment. Coll, back to you.
Yeah, two quite depressing stories about the state of our infrastructure. One in the public sphere and another in the energy one. Really rather grim. And this story is no better. I'm going to talk a bit about Farnborough Air Show, thanks to our friends at the Ferret, who have revealed the Scottish Government's presence at the air show as part of a Team Scotland representative committee of quangos and organisations like Scottish Enterprise. This investigation by Billy Briggs found that the Scottish Government, alongside the other stakeholders I mentioned a moment ago, attended the Farnborough Air Show, which of course is well renowned for its spectacle, but of course is also a defence expo and arms fair. Among the exhibitors in Farnborough were Elbit Systems, BAE Systems, and Barclays. Now, of course, Elbit Systems is Israel's largest weapons manufacturer, providing the vast majority of arms to the Israeli Defense Forces to carry out their genocide in Gaza and ever-widening war across West Asia. The Scottish Government, let's not forget, passed a formal commitment to BDS in September 2024, which, as of yet, there is no indication that it will be enacted, and the story is only further indication of that at a time we know when the war economy is baying for cash. The Scottish Government appear to be prepared to bend over backwards for it. Yes, I think that is a story of particular importance this week. It's also worth noting, I think, that in the time since we last recorded the podcast, the violent and disgraceful scenes across Glasgow in particular that Sam and I addressed in a previous episode have continued, particularly on Saturday the 25th of July, when fascist thugs targeted counter demonstrators, but also people of colour across the city of Glasgow. It's a particularly horrible development. Some of the videos circulating online, really very grim, something that we will return to, but probably out of place for this podcast, given the depth and time required to get into those issues properly. With that said, let's move on to our main story of the week, and that is, of course, Anas Sarwar's move to London. The Scottish Labour Party leader has resigned and taken up a seat in the House of Lords. He will also become a Minister of Trade in Andy Burnham's new Labour government. This has huge implications for Scottish Labour and says a whole lot about the party's fortunes. Anas Sarwar had been in post since prior to the 2021 election. He led Scottish Labour not to one record defeat in Holyrood, but to two record defeats in Holyrood, an unenviable title, to say the least, and yet he seems to have failed upwards and taken his seat on the red benches. I don't think we know what Anas is going to become the Lord of. If we're doing Tweet of the Week, then my particular favourite was someone suggesting that given his private school education, he might become Lord Sarwar of Hutchinson Grammar, which would be entertaining. However, I think it's probably unlikely and not a title fit for the second chamber. Let's get into Anas Sarwar's resignations and its implications. Sam, what did you make of the news?
So I'm going to take the position, perhaps controversial, that there is a world in which this is actually good for Scottish Labour. So I'm going to try and make that case and then explain why we don't yet exist in that world. And I think the first thing that I want to think about is that for me, I didn't have any, maybe you can correct me, but I didn't have any reason to think that Sarwar was going to step down as leader of Scottish Labour anytime soon. Maybe you guys have some reason to think so, but if you didn't think that the disastrous result in the last election, as you said, called the worst in Scottish Labour history under Sarwar for two elections in a row, if you didn't think that was reason enough to step down, then who knows literally how long he would have stayed in place and how many more disastrous results might have been delivered. So obviously, whilst this promotion of Sarwar obviously looks terrible for the party in the sense that it plays directly into this characterization of Scottish Labour as just an extension of UK politics in Scotland. Now all of a sudden there is an opportunity, at least an opportunity, a window within which Scottish Labour can try and shed that branding, establish a new agenda, create some distance from the party that has frankly been battered, in successive elections. And ideally, from our perspective, start trying to outflank the SNP and the rest of Scottish politics from the left. Surely that possibility is now there. But a key part of what would be required as part of this transformation, I think, would be very openly and directly disavowing this precise system of patronage, right, that Sarwar has been able to benefit from. But instead, what I've seen is Jackie Baillie telling STV that she's very pleased for Sarwar and that, in fact, this is about rewarding talent, right? Like, that is the one thing we know that this is not about, is rewarding talent. But, there's some indications that this cue to try and redirect the party is being recognised by some in Scottish Labour. Irish Times reported just earlier this afternoon that Monica Lennons is going to be the first to put her name up for the Labour leadership, at least formally. And some of the things that she said about her leadership bid suggest she understands the scale of the problem for Scottish Labour. So she said, and I quote, "Anyone looking objectively at our party today would conclude a harsh reality. We are in the last chance saloon. Scottish Labour has gone backwards in every Holyrood election since 1999. If we do not change radically and fast, we face oblivion." End quote. I think that she's right. So let's see how this leadership process goes. Does anyone disagree with me that this could be good for Scottish Labour?
Yeah, I mean, I'll willingly come back and disagree with you in the sense that I think this is rearranging deck chairs more than anything else, right? I think where I disagree with Monica Lennon is the idea that this is a last chance saloon and not one of many saloons in which there are no chances remaining. To make a bad metaphor even worse. Yeah, that was dreadful. However, the key point is as follows, right? Anas Sarwar is somebody who failed in his mission as Scottish Labour leader. The campaign that we have talked about endlessly on this podcast that he ran in May 2026 was disastrous. It was pinned on him as an individual and his reputation and his brand. All of those things were rejected comprehensively by the electorate. The result, in fact, saw Scottish Labour get its best result among homeowners, among wealthy individuals earning above £70,000, among swathes of the electorate to whom Scottish Labour and the concept of democratic socialism should be alien, and perform very poorly among those who it is designed to serve. And he didn't just do that once, he did it twice. And the exception to that comes in 2024, in July, when he elects 38 Scottish Labour MPs and wipes the floor with the SNP on a national trend, which ultimately mirrors Starmer south of the border in the sense that it disappears very, very quickly following election day itself. So I don't think this is good news for Scottish Labour, nor do I think Anas Sarwar staying would have been good news for Scottish Labour. Ultimately, I think it's a reflection of the terminal decline in which the party finds itself. And it's interesting that Anas Sarwar has recognised that. It's interesting that he's recognised it now. Ultimately, he is a product of a political dynasty that has dominated the party for over a decade. He is someone who no longer views a future for himself in the party in spite of that dominance. Right? When people like him decide that Scottish Labour's not worth the battle, that they can give it up for a cosy seat in the Lords, it really is a sign that things are on the slide, as is the demographic election result that I talked about a moment ago. Of course, the appointment of Anas Sarwar runs totally contrary to Andy Burnham's promise to break with neoliberalism, right? Precisely because of what I just said. Anas Sarwar is a product of the permanent political class which became so dominant at the peak of neoliberalism in the late noughties and throughout the New Labour years. He cast the party entirely in his image in the 5 years that he was leader. and has to own that, but has not owned that. In fact, as you've said, Sam, his talent has been rewarded with an elevation to the Lords. So this is an absurd appointment from Burnham's point of view, I think, in an otherwise very good week for the incoming Prime Minister regarding comms, perhaps just the permanent Scotland blind spot which exists in number 10. But it's an absurd appointment for Burnham. It's a damning indictment on the party, who have been embarrassed by their former leader, right? Even more embarrassed by Jackie Bailey's absurd defence of him, right? And I think there is an opportunity to evade the likely criticism Scottish Labour are going to receive by talking up Anas Sarwar's foresight in calling for Keir Starmer to resign, which was itself a nakedly opportunistic move designed to save his own skin. He's a chameleon, and that's what's came through in this process. Little more. And I think it says something too about what his 5-year leadership has done to the party in the manner the contest to succeed him has been framed. So you're right, Monica Lennon has declared herself publicly as a candidate in the race. It remains to be seen whether Scottish Labour's governing body, the Scottish Executive Committee, will allow her to stand. There would have to be a timetable agreed which let her get back into Parliament first. She is likely preempted them blocking her by declaring early. I think that's smart. But I think that there is a broader point about how the campaign's likely to be conducted. It's entirely apolitical. It's procedural. It's about rescuing the party from the doldrums in which it finds itself, but absent any necessary vision for the party or its politics. It's instead about operational questions, electoral composition questions, not about politics, not about rescuing social democracy in Scotland. If it can be done, there's a total absence of political philosophy running through it by virtue of the nature of the party that Sarwar ran for the last 5 years. Nullified any politics, so that what you get is this contest between the prospect of electoral oblivion and recognising that, or saying that Anas Sarwar wasn't too bad. So really, really, really banal, I think. But that is a rant, and perhaps unkind to your optimism, Sam. But let's bring Rory in, who can hopefully mediate this tension.
Yeah, I don't know. Does that make me a centrist between the two of you if I see both of your points? I'm rather uncomfortable with that label, but I see this the silver lining is that there is a chance to wrest Scottish Labour back towards a more democratic socialist position. I don't know if you can say that these days with the Labour Party, but I think the challenge with that is the lack of a presence of any genuine left within Scottish Labour these days. I think any socialists of socialists of a sort of traditional socialist ilk have been long since purged or have left themselves. I think it's unsurprising that Monica Lennon would stand again, and I agree with you, Coll. I think it's tactical, and I also think the ensuing leadership contest, which will, if things pan out as we might expect them to, it's probably going to be between Monica Lennon and perhaps Michael Mara, who I think is currently the shadow finance secretary, but was previously a shadow education secretary, a Dundee MSP. He's broadly seen as a sort of continuity candidate. I think other people whose hats may be in the ring or have been mentioned include Daniel Johnson, who has also had a finance brief. I think still does have some element of a finance brief. People have also touted Jackie Bailey, which, as we know, is a sort of ultra Blairite option. So I think realistically, between Michael Mara and Monica Lennon, who has a greater profile among the wider Scottish public, because of course, to save Scottish Labour, it's going to require some level of deepening its institutional roots to communities and getting back into sort of doing the things that the Labour Party and trade unions should be doing. Do I see that as a likely thing under either? Not hugely, but there's also a certain level of personality which needs to come into it, I think, for Scotland anyway. Does anybody know who Michael Maher is? I don't think so. Frankly, it's another grey suit, to be honest, picking up from Anas Sarwar, and that lack of character really says a lot about what Scottish Labour is. Monica Lennon has a very high profile bit of legislation in the sort of period poverty bill to put behind her name, which also indicates a good amount of cross-party work. So I think might be viewed better within the broader public. And she's also worked quite recently on an ecocide bill. But of course, she didn't make it into Parliament in the most recent election, so she has that as a black mark against her name, in that she wasn't high enough up the list, and Labour didn't perform well enough in Scotland. So I see the silver linings. I see the bad parts too. I think the main thing which I took away from this was, and it kind of tags on to what you were saying, Coll. It is an odd choice for Andy Burnham to do this, right? And when he's talking about a sort of a circuit breaker, and then he's giving out Lords positions to bring people into cabinet, isn't that just what the last few governments have already been doing? It's a bad look, and I think people in Scotland, or certainly the political class in Scotland, have been characterising this whole Number 10 North week as being, look, guys, you've forgotten about us here. And I think this also speaks to that a little bit in that sense, not to mention the fact that there's about 30 other MPs in Parliament who could take up 30 other Scottish MPs, I should say, who could take up a position in the business department under Jonathan Reynolds. So I do think it's strange. Like I feel like it's spending a lot of political capital in Scotland that he doesn't need to. And well, look, the flip side of it is that I actually am not that surprised Anas Sarwar would do this. If we remember, we talked about how much he wanted to pitch himself as mayor of Glasgow if he could, and to join the sort of the king of the mayors, as it were, Andy Burnham down in Manchester, I guess. Then, like, this is Anas Sarwar's dream come true in many ways, right? And I think it also says a lot about what type of leader he was, in the fact that he's going to the business department of anything, right? It's a pro-business stance. That's what he always was standing for. And just lastly, it's a bit sickening, to be honest, just to see it looks as if this sort of Mancunian cohort have coalesced around Burnham, and their analysis of Scotland has really just fallen by the wayside, in the sense that Douglas Alexander stays in cabinet, a man who is in charge of Scottish Labour's election campaigns. Jackie Baillie, obviously, it's in the branch party, but I guess they have some influence too. But Jackie Baillie, who was a key strategist as well in Scottish Labour over the last few years, particularly I think with regard to manifestos, and Anas Sarwar, who was showing no sign of resigning. He wanted to continue up until this cushy wee opportunity comes up. What does that say? These three people who have a really strong hand in dictating what Labour politics in Scotland looks like are not facing any consequences for very, very bad election results. I mean, granted, I said it wasn't as bad initially as it may appear. I still don't think it was a good result, but I mean, in the grand scheme of things, just it's senseless.
Yes, I quite agree, and I think there's a couple of very brief points before we move on. Sam said, and in a way you're right, Sam, about not seeing this coming, right? I think you can see it coming, right? Anas Sarwar has been nowhere since May, not given a single interview, not really bothered to turn up to Parliament in any way and make interventions in any meaningful way. He's been the ghost haunting the banquet, right? Like, it's very clear that he wants out of there, sees no viable prospect in the party, and yet still you get things like this on the 14th of May, right? Following the Scottish election result, following this historic result, on the day that Anas Sarwar was sworn into Parliament to resume his mandate as a list MSP, Alison Taylor, one of Scottish Labour's MPs who represents the Paisley constituency in Westminster, tweeted this: "Next FM. He has served his country with all his heart till now, and Scotland will just have to wait a little longer. Best things are worth waiting for." This is an actual MP, right, 1 week after Scottish Labour return their worst ever election result, bemoaning the fact that Scotland will have to wait 5 years to enjoy and delight in Anas Sarwar's brilliance in Butte House. I mean, to your point, Sam, about Jackie Baillie, who's ruled herself out for leadership, talking about Anas Sarwar's talent, she's not the only one. This goes right through the party. And until you can get rid of that mentality, which seems baked in at this point, there's just no hope. On the prospect of no hope, let's move on to Andy Burnham, who has had his first week as Prime Minister and used it to make some important announcements. For the purposes of this conversation, we will dwell on Scotland. During a first meeting with First Minister John Swinney, Andy Burnham ruled out the prospect of a second Scottish independence referendum, saying that such a vote was off limits as far as Downing Street was concerned. Of course, red meat to the SNP. We should talk about this, but before we do, I just want to run through some of Andy Burnham's Scottish Cabinet posts, which I think are important for folk to know. Obviously, it's been well reported that Douglas Alexander remains in his position as Secretary of State for Scotland, and of course Anas Sarwar is to become a Trade Minister. In other news, Blair McDougall takes on a dual mandate as an Energy Minister and a business manager and a business minister, apologies. Blair McDougall, of course, the architect of that 2014 Better Together referendum campaign. Ian Murray, former Scottish Secretary, will remain within the Culture Department, but with a decreased role. Kirsty McNeill has taken on a new role at the Foreign Office, a promotion from her previous role working beneath Douglas Alexander in the Scotland Office. Melanie Ward, again, will join Douglas Alexander at the Scotland Office, and that is about the extent of it. Worth noting that both Sabir Ahmed and Imogen Walker, the wife of Morgan McSweeney, will not be returning to government. Let's talk about Andy Burnham, however, and ruling out this second referendum. Not surprising, but nonetheless worth having a chat about. Rory, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, you said it, Coll. Not surprising. It was always going to be the case. He's already said he's going to govern by the manifesto. That's his way of avoiding a general election. Look, I mean, I think in Andy Burnham's eyes, it's probably been quite a good week. You know, he's hit the grid excellently in terms of a very strong cabinet day on Monday. I mean, not that I necessarily agree with the cabinet picks. A Tuesday, you know, he's talking about and he's talking about ending rough sleeping and trying to draw on his own record for that. Again, questionable, but that's how he framed it. Scrapping VAT on energy bills, a £2 bus fare cap, which the SNP were also talking about in the election. So I think that'll be interesting to see how those two parties work together on that. And I think it speaks volumes somewhat about John Swinney, that his priority is talking about independence. And look, I think Scotland should be independent as much as the next person who believes in self-determination. But it gets a bit nauseating after a while when it's continually SNP, independence referendum, yada, 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 and not actually some of those core things which you can work together on in the meantime, in the progress to get to not even necessarily a referendum. So I think it's a little bit deluded to sort of cast aside the fact that not even 60% of the Scottish public support independence yet. It's continually stagnated, the polls. So I think the SNP and John Swinney should be thinking more practically about how can voters, you know, they have just voted them back in. I doubt they're going to do it again in 5 years. So if they do want to hang on to voters, then, you know, you need to actually do some things now, unfortunately for them, I guess. And the £2 bus fare cap would have been an absolutely great bit of electioneering, a bit of political strategy to say, look, we're working together with this guy who's got a great bounce in the polls already, and who is talking about devolutionary policies. You know, I think it would have sent a better message. So that's my core takeaway. You know, otherwise, I think Burnham has signalled himself to be quite sort of Keynesian, but military Keynesian in his economic policy, and that is a big warning. But I can anticipate out of that coming some discussion with the Scottish government about investment in places like BAE Systems, Babcock, Thales, all of whom are, based in and around Scotland in various places. We know that Andy Burnham was at a trade fair alongside Wes Streeting, where a number of defense firms, including some Israeli companies, I believe, were touting their products. And so I think we can anticipate more of that to come. And I know we're sort of focusing specifically on Scotland, but I think there are other issues here which blend in a real mesh, and I think that speaks to the sort of challenge of governing the UK. One of them, which I think is a notable position, is the new AI minister, Kanishka Narayan, who I think is a Welsh MP. That is a really, I think it's not a full cabinet secretary position. It's just the minister, I think, within the. Actually, I'm not sure which department's in, but anyway. It's an important role to play because it's going to say a lot about Andy Burnham's position on potentially industrial strategy going forward, given we know the role that certain governments, especially the Scottish government, are placing on AI and data centres, but also on tech regulation, on the sort of innovation economy, as they like to call it. Now, I know that the innovation economy was a large part of the growth package that Burnham was trying to champion as Manchester mayor, and I know it's also what the Glasgow City Council are trying to do as well. But I realize I've rambled on. The last thing I'd say is really worth reading Tom Blackburn's take in Tribune this week about the cabinet, which I want to read this section out because I think it sums up perfectly the appointments. The new cabinet is a potentially uneasy coalition between the Atlanticist pro-imperialist Labour right and the soft left, which has a long history of saying many of the right things only to compromise and capitulate when it comes to the crunch. And I think that really sums up what we should expect. And I want this government to succeed far more than previously because I like Burnham personally more than Starmer, but I'm bracing myself for disappointment.
Sam, let's go to you, and then we'll try and wrap up before 40 minutes.
Yeah, I'll be quick. And yeah, I do agree that the way that militarism that is going to be integrated into the industrial policy of the UK is still to be seen. Although Healy's appointment as Chancellor indicates is going to go in one direction, but that's something we'll be talking about a lot going forward, and especially the Scottish government's response is something that needs to be watched. But in terms of independence, I mean, there's a perspective which I think is understandable that Burnham's refusal to allow a referendum on Scottish independence is inconsistent somehow with his promotion of devolution, which is supposed to be a core part of his program. This idea is rational in a particular sense because there's certainly a tension when the Prime Minister says we need to trust the various areas of the country to govern themselves because they understand better than central government what is needed. But then for him also to put a hard cap and say, no, actually, the most fundamental questions, namely constitutional, are off limits. So this tension kind of, it does raise questions about exactly where Burnham's planning to draw the line on devolving powers elsewhere in the country. But I think ultimately my view is that this refusal to allow the referendum, as Rory says, not remotely surprising. And it's also perfectly consistent with Burnham's devolution agenda, which I see as part of his agenda precisely because the legitimacy of the union is at historic lows when you look at the picture across the devolved nations. Both devolution and PR for Burnham, I think, are responses to and ways of managing this crisis of the British state and British politics and its inability, or in my view, its unwillingness for decades to improve living standards, maintain a social contract, support social mobility. So I don't see this as inconsistent at all, especially if the British state is going to continue to fail to deliver on these things. Because as we've discussed on this program before, one side effect of devolution is that it's the offloading of responsibility from central government to actually deliver all of these things. That's a negative externality of it. So from my point of view, yeah, this is perfectly consistent with unionist devolution, this stance he's taken on Scottish independence, which is not to say that I agree with the policy.
Yeah, I'll keep this brief because I know we're tight for time, but I do think it's worth reflecting on what this says about the SNP. Andy Burnham has been able to come to power at a point of historic weakness for the Labour Party, at a time when it is enduring a crisis of legitimacy across these islands. Terrible results in Scotland, Wales, and England, respectively, at a time when it is in a period of decomposition as a force. And yet, within days of coming into office, he has been able to brush off the SNP with ease, with total ease, right? This is a party that just won a historic fifth mandate, right? Who should be able to leverage the political capital that they have been able to accumulate over the last 17, 18 years to demand the right to a second vote. They should have been able to innovate in the face of successive rejections from Westminster, who have been able to do nothing more than question successive prime ministers as to why they won't grant that second vote. And yes, of course, devolution constrains the referendum question. And it's outrageous that Burnham can bat off the SNP so easily on principle. But I think it says something else about the fact that John Swinney's strategy resulted in hoping that the Mayor of Manchester, purely by virtue of the fact that he was not from London, would see the light and enable Scotland to have the vote that it so richly deserves in Swinney's conception, right? It's so low energy, so pitiful in its almost begging, right? Like, I really do think that it in some ways says far more about the SNP than it does about Burnham, precisely because of how expected it was, right? And it's like, why did you expect this to be any different? And I suppose it cuts to the core of the question, which is that the SNP knew that Burnham was going to brush it off, right? They knew exactly what he was going to say. And that's fine, because it keeps the circus going and the hamster wheel keeps turning. And the reality is that it is perfect for Scotland's permanent political class, to go back to the point with which we began this episode, for as long as it keeps people in seats. Maybe that's cynical, but a note of cynicism to end a podcast like this on is always healthy, I think, and we will leave it there. It's been a pleasure, Rory and Sam. Thanks for joining me today. We will be back in your podcast feed next Monday. Look out for our other longer form podcast, as ever, Nest of Fearties. In the meantime, if you're in a position to do so, you can find Skotia on Patreon, where you can support us for as little as the price of an expensive coffee a month. We'll see you soon. Thanks very much for listening.